It was just after dusk when Malcolm Bennett pulled into the rest stop off I-84. He'd been driving for hours, making his way back to Hartford after visiting his elderly mother in upstate New York. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a beat-up sedan and two highway patrol cruisers idling near the bathroom facility. Malcolm stepped out, stretched his legs, and headed toward the vending machines. As he walked, he noticed the patrol officers glance at him and start whispering. He ignored it, had seen that look before. But as he returned to his car with a bottle of water and a protein bar, their voices turned to direct commands. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Malcolm paused. "Is something wrong, officer?" "Let's see some ID." "You match a description." The phrase hit with that familiar edge. Calmly, Malcolm handed over his license and kept his hands visible. Still, within seconds, one of the officers had him turned around, hands behind his back. "No sudden moves. Just cooperating, right?" one said as he fastened the cuffs. Malcolm didn't argue. No use. He'd learned long ago that explaining things in the moment rarely made a difference. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check anything. They just drove him down to the local precinct, booked him, and left him in a cell with no answers. His wallet, phone, and briefcase, gone for now. When he asked to make a call, they laughed and walked away. He sat on the cold bench that night in silence, watching time crawl by. He didn't sleep. By morning, the officers had clearly moved on. A younger cop unlocked the cell without a word and handed Malcolm his things. No explanation. No apology. Just a cold, "You're free to go." Malcolm didn't ask why. He just nodded, checked that his wallet and phone were intact, and walked out into the brisk morning air. The sun was rising, casting gold across the empty street. He called a car service and sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as the town rolled by. By 9 a.m., he stood in front of the courthouse, freshly showered, crisp suit pressed, black robe folded neatly over his arm. Security nodded him through without question. Inside, the courtroom was quiet, sunlight slanting through the tall windows. Malcolm took a deep breath, stepped into his chambers, and put on the robe. As he looked in the mirror, he adjusted the collar and straightened the gold nameplate on his chest. Honorable Malcolm L. Bennett, Superior Court Judge. He checked the docket for the morning. First case, People vs. Officers Grant, Mercer, and Doyle. Malcolm stared at the names for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted, calm, measured resolve hardening like stone. At 10 a.m., he entered the courtroom. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Malcolm walked in, stepped up to the bench, and glanced toward the defense table. 3 men stood slowly, in pressed uniforms. The same 3 who had shoved him into a cruiser without cause just 12 hours ago. Their eyes widened as they recognized him. He's Saturday, the court is now in session. The 3 officers, Grant, Mercer, and Doyle, froze in place. Their faces drained of color. The courtroom, once bustling with quiet chatter, fell silent. Even the court clerk glanced up with raised eyebrows. Judge Malcolm Bennett adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork. His tone was calm, steady, judicial. "We're here today to address the charges brought forth against Officers Grant, Mercer, and Doyle in connection with the unlawful detainment of a civilian at a state-operated rest stop." He didn't mention himself. Not yet. His role now was not to relive a personal slight, it was to uphold the law. The facts would speak for themselves. The prosecutor stood and began to read the formal complaint, referencing dashcam footage, incident reports, and testimony from a bystander who'd filmed part of the stop from across the lot. That footage had already made its way up the chain overnight, triggering internal affairs to take immediate action. That's why the hearing had been fast-tracked. Malcolm watched the officers squirm in their seats. They hadn't even known who they had cuffed. To them, he'd just been a guy in a hoodie at the wrong place at the wrong time. But now they were learning, not every man they judge at a glance is powerless. Defense counsel shifted nervously. Your Honor, if I may request a postponement, given the emerging circumstances of the case. Malcolm raised one eyebrow. Request denied, he said, evenly. This hearing will proceed as scheduled. He leaned forward just slightly, hands folded. I trust the defense is prepared. The three officers didn't dare look up. The defense attorney cleared his throat and stood stiffly. Yes, Your Honor, though I'd like to note for the record that we were not made aware of your, prior contact with the defendants. Malcolm remained composed. That's correct. And I'm not here to serve personal interest. This hearing is being recorded, observed by legal oversight, and will proceed under full transparency. Now, unless you're filing a formal motion for recusal, the attorney hesitated. No, Your Honor. Then proceed. The first witness was called, a state internal affairs officer who had reviewed the footage and filed the misconduct charges. The courtroom screen lit up with video from the patrol car, Malcolm walking to his car, carrying a snack and water. The voice of Officer Grant filled the room, loud and clipped, Hey! Step away from the vehicle. Hands up. No probable cause. No warning. The recording showed everything. Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The evidence did the speaking. As the officer on the stand laid out each misstep, failure to verify ID, no radio check-in, no official report filed after the detainment, everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight of the mistake. The three defendants sat stone still. Their own department had turned on them, not out of vengeance, but because their actions had crossed a line too blatant to ignore. Malcolm calmly noted, let the record reflect that the department confirms the complainant was never suspected in any ongoing investigation and had no outstanding warrants. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at them. Sometimes, gentlemen, he said quietly, the person you assume has no voice is the one you'll have to answer to. As the hearing continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom turned dense, like the air before a storm. The officer's lawyer began grasping at technicalities, trying to minimize the incident. Your Honor, this was an unfortunate misunderstanding, he said. My clients acted under the assumption of a matching description and followed protocol as best they understood it. Malcolm gave a slight nod. And yet, he replied, nowhere in that protocol does it state that you may ignore identification, bypass radio verification, or detain without articulable suspicion. He turned back to the internal affairs officer. Was any attempt made to verify the civilian's identity before placing him in handcuffs? No, Your Honor. Was there any call logged from the rest stop location during the incident? None. Malcolm turned the page on the file slowly. Then it appears they not only failed in their duties, they violated the very rules meant to protect both citizens and the integrity of the department. The defense attorney's jaw tensed. We request the court consider their years of service, their clean records. This court considers everything, Malcolm interrupted gently. Including how quickly trust in a badge can erode when misused. He leaned back. I was that man at the rest stop. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Grant's mouth fell open. Mercer dropped his pen. Doyle shifted in his chair like it had suddenly grown hot. Malcolm continued without raising his voice. You didn't know who I was. That's the problem. You treated me based on a glance, not the law. And today, the law is what you'll answer to. The silence in the courtroom stretched like wire. Judge Bennett's words lingered in the air, echoing louder than any gavel. The officers looked stunned, trapped between shame and disbelief. Their attorney reached for composure, but the momentum had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Malcolm remained calm. This court does not hand out punishment based on emotion, he said, his voice even. It weighs actions. Intent. Accountability. He tapped the case file lightly. The state has brought forward formal charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, and unlawful detainment. These are not small accusations. These are fractures in public trust. The prosecutor rose again and laid out the department's internal findings: body cam inconsistencies, false reports filed after the fact, and a deliberate failure to log the incident in the system. Malcolm spoke with clarity, addressing the defendants directly now. You had the opportunity to correct your mistake. Instead, you let an innocent man sit in a cell while you fabricated justification after the fact. That tells this court it wasn't just a bad call. It was a deliberate cover-up. Officer Doyle tried to speak. Your Honor, I don't, Malcolm said, his tone firm. You had a chance to speak when you took someone's freedom away. You said nothing then. He turned to the clerk. These proceedings will move forward to full trial under review of judicial conduct and civil rights protocol. Then he looked back at the room, at the gallery, the press, the law clerks, and the defense table. Let it be known, he said, that justice is not about vengeance. It's about balance. And that balance begins with accountability, even from those who wear the badge. The courtroom stood still. As Judge Bennett stood and exited the courtroom, a quiet murmur swelled behind him. The press, though instructed not to speak, began furiously scribbling and whispering to one another. Word was already spreading through the courthouse corridors like wildfire: the judge they arrested was their judge. Inside the defense table, the three officers looked wrecked. Mercer had his face in his hands. Grant stared blankly at the table. Doyle simply looked lost, like he was finally realizing the full weight of what they'd done. Outside, news vans had gathered. The story was bigger than just misconduct. It was a complete reversal of assumptions, a living example of what happens when unchecked power is held up to the light. By midday, Internal Affairs had issued a press release confirming full administrative leave for all three officers pending investigation. The police union was quiet, carefully watching its tone. Community leaders released statements urging calm but firm accountability. As for Judge Malcolm Bennett, he returned to his chambers, removed his robe, and sat silently for a moment, letting the gravity of the day settle. His assistant, Carla, knocked softly and entered. You all right? He nodded slowly. Just thinking how close justice sometimes comes to being a coincidence. Carla gave a small, understanding smile. Not this time. He looked out the window, past the glass, past the crowd, past the courthouse steps. No, he said quietly. This time, justice walked in on its own feet. By the next morning, headlines blazed across national media: detained at rest stop, now he's their judge. Courtroom stunned as arrested man revealed to be the presiding judge. When the gavel hits back, officers face trial led by man they cuffed. Social media exploded. The footage from the courtroom, especially the moment Judge Bennett calmly revealed his identity, had gone viral. Commentators, legal analysts, and everyday citizens weighed in from every corner of the country. But back in Hartford, the conversation was more personal. In local barber shops, diners, and schools, people weren't just talking about irony, they were talking about integrity. At a small law college downtown, a criminal justice professor paused her lecture and played the courtroom clip. When it ended, she looked at her students. This, she said, is why character matters. Because power doesn't just show up in a uniform or a title, it shows up in how you treat someone when you think they have none. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered, wondering what would happen next. Some defended their colleagues. Others didn't say a word. But everyone knew, the shield of assumption had cracked. Back at the courthouse, Malcolm kept his schedule. No media appearances. No interviews. He let the system do its work. That was always the point. Still, when a young public defender stopped him in the hall and said, "Sir, what you did in that courtroom, it changed something," Malcolm simply nodded. "It wasn't about me," he replied. "It was about the system remembering who it's supposed to serve." Weeks passed, but the storm didn't fade. The officer's trial was set, and the courtroom was already expected to be packed. Cameras weren't allowed during the proceedings, but every reporter in the state had requested a seat. Judge Bennett, in accordance with judicial ethics, had recused himself from presiding over the full trial. Another judge had been appointed, one with a reputation for balance and fairness. But Malcolm's presence still loomed. Not as a witness. Not as a plaintiff. Just as a reminder. He never once gave a public statement. He didn't need to. The legal system was speaking for itself now, and for once, the volume was loud enough to hear. One morning, Malcolm received a handwritten letter. "Dear Judge Bennett, I don't know how you stayed so composed. If that had been me, I would have broken down or blown up. You didn't. You stood there and let the law speak. That gave me hope again. A law student, another arrived the same day. You made me believe that maybe there's still such a thing as justice. Not perfect. But real. Thank you." He placed them both in his desk drawer, beside a framed photo of his father, once a bus driver, always proud, always warning him never to let anger make him small. Justice, Malcolm knew, wasn't revenge. It was patience under pressure. Truth with weight. The day before the trial began, he walked past a group of officers outside the courthouse. One of them nodded respectfully and said, "Good morning, Your Honor." Malcolm paused. For a second, nothing was said. Then he gave a polite nod back. "Morning, officer." The wind blew quietly across the steps. The trial of Officers Grant, Mercer, and Doyle lasted 4 days. Witnesses were called. Footage reviewed. Expert testimony laid bare the protocols ignored. The defense tried to paint the incident as a mistake, but the facts were unshakable. Not only had the officers unlawfully detained an innocent man, they had failed to report it properly, and worse, doubled down afterward with false paperwork. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When the verdict was read, the courtroom sat breathless. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced each officer to probation, loss of certification, and mandatory public accountability hearings. No jail time, but their careers in law enforcement were effectively over. Outside, reporters swarmed for a statement. Malcolm Bennett, as always, remained silent, until one young journalist, no older than 25, broke through the noise with a simple question, "Judge Bennett, do you believe justice was served?" He looked at her. "I believe a message was delivered," he said. "One that doesn't just speak to officers or courts, but to everyone who thinks power is something you can wear or flash. Power is earned through how you treat people when no one's watching." Then he turned and walked down the steps, briefcase in hand, robe folded beneath his arm. Not as a symbol. Not as a victim. As a man who let the law speak louder than the moment, and reminded the country that the bench isn't just a seat of judgment, it's a test of who you choose to be when it's your turn to hold the gavel. Weeks after the trial, the headlines faded. The media moved on, as it always does. But the impact remained, in smaller ways, quieter places. At a police training academy just outside Albany, instructors revised a section of their curriculum. The new title, Assumption versus Law, the Rest Stop Case Study. In a local law school seminar, students now debated the ethical lines of power, citing Bennett versus Grant as a landmark in modern conduct hearings, even though it wasn't officially classified as such. In neighborhoods across the state, parents told their kids the story, not as a cautionary tale of fear, but of poise, dignity, and restraint. And in the courthouse where it all began, Judge Malcolm Bennett returned to his daily docket. Small claims. Custody hearings. Motions. Warrants. Real lives. Real consequences. One afternoon, a rookie officer nervously entered his courtroom for a sworn affidavit procedure. He looked young, maybe 23. As he stood before the bench, he seemed uneasy. Malcolm noticed. "Something wrong, officer?" The young man cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor. It's an honor, sir." Malcolm offered a slight smile. "Do your job," he said gently. "And never forget who it's really for." The officer nodded, steadied himself, and proceeded. Outside, the courthouse flag fluttered in the wind, quietly, firmly. Justice didn't shout. It didn't chase cameras. It simply showed up. And sometimes, it wore a black robe and a memory no one would forget. Months later, the world had mostly moved on. The courthouse returned to its rhythm. The news cycle replaced Malcolm's story with new headlines. But beneath the surface, the ripple continued, small, powerful, undeniable. Judge Malcolm Bennett sat alone in his chambers one evening, long after court had adjourned. The sun was setting outside, casting warm light across the shelves of legal books behind him. He reached into his drawer and pulled out the 2 letters he'd kept, the ones from the law student and the hopeful stranger. He read them again, quietly. The paper had started to yellow at the corners. A knock at the door. It was Carla, his assistant. "You've got someone waiting in the hallway," she said softly. "A young man. Says he wants to thank you in person." Malcolm looked up, curious. She added, "He said he became a public defender because of what happened that day." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Send him in." A minute later, the young man walked in, well-dressed, eyes clear, voice steady. He introduced himself, and Malcolm offered a seat. They spoke for almost an hour. About justice. About choices. About what it means to carry power without ever using it for the wrong reasons. When the young lawyer finally stood to leave, he shook Malcolm's hand and said, "That one day in court, it changed how I see everything. Thank you for standing tall." Malcolm replied with a quiet smile. "Thank you for being the one who'll carry it forward." When the door finally closed, Malcolm sat in silence for a long while, then turned off the lamp on his desk. Justice, he thought, wasn't a moment. It was a legacy. And some legacies begin not with a trial, but with a single decision to stay calm, when no one else would.